This video is on Unit 4, Evolution. This is for the Biology EOC review. So as we began talking about evolution, we talked about some people from history's past who believed in a concept called spontaneous generation. Now, spontaneous generation is the idea that life can just spontaneously come to be. One of the first major proponents of this was Aristotle, who taught this. But later, a man by the name of Francisco Redi came along, and he wanted to disprove spontaneous generation. So how did he do that? He set up an experiment, which we've talked about. In that experiment, whereas he had a couple of jars, and draw some jars here. And in each of these jars, he placed some meat. Maybe it was just 2 jars. Anyway, here's a piece of meat. Here's a piece of meat. And maybe this is a piece of meat too. All right, and so in jar A, he puts the piece of meat in there, doesn't cover the piece of meat, and then of course later on, things start to grow in the meat called maggots, because, well, what do we know today? Little flies came and laid their eggs on the meat and then flew away and left. Well, so for the second jar, jar B, he decided that he would take and actually cover this jar with something to keep the flies out. And lo and behold, many days went by without, this is the next day or whatever, there were still no maggots. Life did not spontaneously generate because the flies weren't able to get there. They weren't able to lay their eggs. Well, this wasn't very convincing to some. And so another man by the name of Needham comes along. And Needham said, no, spontaneous generation does actually occur. And so he takes a flask and he fills it with water. And in that water is just some nutrients of sorts. And he boils that for a while, and later leaves that flask uncovered. Boiling it, of course, would have said we know that there's nothing else living in there, of course. Well, what happened later? The flask was cloudy with bacteria or some sort of microorganism. And so Needham said, look, this is what happened. We boiled it to kill off anything that might have been in there. We left it out, and then look, life came to be by itself. Well, Spallanzani, the next man to come around, said no, Needham's experiment was wrong. And so the way he disproved that is he actually set up the same experiment and boiled it. All right, but this time he actually put a stopper on the flask, and what that allowed that to do is nothing else could get in there. And so we wait a few weeks and we still see the same situation. Well, finally, a man by the name of Louis Pasteur comes along, and Pasteur solves this conundrum once and for all because he designs a special flask. It looks something like this. And in it he had the same sort of, my nutrient broth changes color every time, the same sort of nutrient broth, but he had this flask, and what this flask does is it keeps things from getting in. Air is allowed to come in, but air is allowed to come in, but nothing else can get in because of the way that the neck of the flask is built. And so what he did is he boiled this solution and waited days and even weeks, and nothing grew in the broth. Why? Because life has to come from other life. In order to prove this, he later broke the top off of that flask, and of course, what you expect happened. Life came to be in it. Lots of microorganisms grew in it. And so Pasteur, once and for all, proved that life does not spontaneously generate. Now, these are all men that came before Charles Darwin, but there are some other men that came before Charles Darwin that laid the pathway for Darwin's understanding of evolution. Here's just a few of them. Last names only. Hutton, he looked at the rock layers, and he said, well, based on these rock layers, the Earth has to be very old. All right, and the Earth has to be very old, and this is different for this time and place because most people then believe that the Earth was very young. And so all these geological structures had to form over a course of millions of years, not thousands of years. Darwin was listening. Another man by the name of Thomas Malthus was an economist, actually, and Malthus lived in London, and he saw the overpopulation, and from his ideas believed that people there in London were the reason that they're homeless and the reason that there was poverty and crime was because there was a limited amount of resources. And if there's a limited amount of resources, then there will be competition for those resources. And the best will survive. All right. So for Malthus, the best would have been the richest or whatever, or the most well off. But obviously for Darwin, he's looking into more natural systems. And so what Malthus said, if there's not a limiting factor, which we'll just do limiting factor here is this dotted line. If there's not a limiting factor, then populations will grow exponentially. Because if you can eliminate that limiting factor, then populations will continue to grow through that. Well, there's a few more. Another man by the name of Lyell was another geologist, and he studied changes on the Earth, particularly like weathering and other types of erosion and that kind of thing as he looked at the Earth. And he also believed that if changes are happening on the Earth, these changes take a very long time, and the Earth then is very old. And so Darwin thought if the Earth changes, then this must be happening to the organisms that live on it as well. And if organisms change, it also has to take a very long time, just like the changes on the Earth take place. Well, at the same time that Darwin was coming up with his ideas on natural selection, another man by the name of Wallace was coming up with his ideas as well. And his ideas were very similar to Darwin's, and he had his own theory of natural selection. And Darwin actually read his work before he published his own book on the origins of on the origins of species. Now, one more person that we should mention that Darwin actually opposed was a man by the name of John Baptiste Lamarck. And Lamarck believed that organisms had what he called an inner drive toward perfection. The example that's always used with Lamarck is this idea of a giraffe, and the giraffe is out in the savannah or whatever in Africa and sees a leaf on a tree that it can't reach and thinks, well, if I could just grow my neck longer, I could reach and will stretch its neck out, and finally be able to reach that tree. Well, not only that, but this particular giraffe whose inner drive was able to change itself, it is able to pass that acquired trait on to the next generation. And so future generations are able to acquire these same traits over the course of their life. And so essentially, Lamarck said that through the use and disuse of particular structures, an organism could get better over time. All right, another example would be something like whales. Lamarck would have said that as he looked at whales and the fossil record for whales, that whales did not use their hind legs, and so that they eventually lost them. Now, this is counter to Darwin's ideas on natural selection, because natural selection simply states that changes occur, and the best changes will win out in the end. Whereas Lamarck said these changes occur because of something that the organism actually wants. Sort of an inner drive. Now, a little bit about Charles Darwin. So Darwin was an English naturalist, and he was on a boat called the HMS Beagle, and he was actually asked to be on the boat by the ship's captain. Boats had to have a naturalist in those days, and so it was right for him to pick Darwin to go with him. And they were to sail around the world over the course of the next 5 years. And when Darwin did this, they stopped at many ports, and of course Darwin would get off and he would collect all these different species from around the world. And he began to notice patterns in species. He began to notice that some species in one part of the world, say Australia, were very similar in other parts of the world that had similar kinds of conditions. You know, maybe a rainforest in Australia would have similar types of organisms that the rainforest in Indonesia and in Brazil would have. He noted that. He also noted that each species or each organism was particularly adapted for its own environment. That each organism was adapted for its own environment. When he went to the Galapagos Islands, that's where he's famous for being, on the Galapagos Islands. And it was there that he noticed that these different birds were perfectly adapted for their particular environment. Maybe this bird eats seeds. Well, its beak was perfect for eating seeds. Or this bird eats insects. This bird's beak was perfect for eating insects. And so from that, Darwin began to conclude that because animals are always specifically adapted for the environment that they're in, that change, and because the earth is changing constantly, then animals must also be changing to meet the needs of their particular environment. And so this is when he published his book on the origin of species, and this is where he came up with his theory of natural selection or evolution by natural selection. And there are 4 particular postulates when it comes to natural selection that Darwin used. The first is this: that in a population, that population will have variation. What is variation? There's just different physical characteristics within a population. Any given population, not all the organisms are going to look alike, because there are different things that causes variation in a population, which we'll talk about. And these variations lead to different adaptations. Take a population of deer that live in a very cold environment. Well, if the temperature of that environment drops 50 degrees and over the course of 1,000 years, which seems pretty drastic, but you get the idea, then we would expect deer with thicker coats and the best variations for that colder weather to be the ones that survive into that cold generation. And so those adaptations create more fitness, and fitness is just an organism's ability to survive. Well, his next idea was the idea of overproduction. And this has to do with Malthus. Overproduction. That a population will produce more individuals than are able to survive. The typical population will produce more individuals than are able to survive. And so populations want to grow exponentially, but there are those limiting factors in a population that are going to stop it from doing that. And so only certain individuals are going to be able to survive. And that's where his next idea came from, which is the struggle for existence. That if there's going to be variation in population, some organisms are better at surviving than others. If organisms typically produce more offspring than are able to survive, then there will be a struggle for existence. And the limiting factors in a population are going to dictate the amount of that population that can survive. And so that brings us to the last point, and that is the idea of differential reproductive success. Differential reproductive success. The best adaptations will get the most resources and will be the most fit. There's always going to be a competition for food. There's always going to be a competition for territory, for mates, whatever. And the organisms that are the best adapted will survive. And survival not only means waking up to live another day, but it also means reproducing, seeing your genes go on to the next generation. And this is where we get this idea of survival of the fittest. You have enough energy, plus you have the best mate, that's going to equal reproductive success. Now, that gives us a good definition then for the word evolution. Evolution, simply put, is the change in a population over time. Now, we will get more specific on what that change is, because it has to do with gene frequencies, but the change in a population over time based on these principles of natural selection.